And action! Okay, Darlene had a nice question on leaky gut, so I thought I'd explain it in a short sentence, but it's impossible. Leaky gut is also known as increased intestinal permeability. And I think what's important is to understand why people get so bloated. I won't go through all the details of what happens or the theory of leaky gut, but here we go. So I drew this as an explanation for what happens with a colon. It's not the typical anatomy picture you might find, but up here is the stomach. This squiggly tube here is called the small intestine, and then this is the colon. So when you eat something and you chew it properly, it mixes in with saliva, it starts to be broken down. Then you swallow it down the esophagus and it ends up in this pouch called the stomach. The stomach essentially secretes acid. And when it secretes acid, it melts solid. It essentially is a juicer, right? It turns solid into liquid. And once the solid is turned into liquid and all that acid, it is now digestible. So when it gets to a good consistency, the pyloric sphincter opens up and it sends it into the small intestine. Small intestine is just this long, about 20-foot tube of villi. The villi that are responsible for absorbing macronutrients. They're supposed to have a really tough lining, and the lining is supposed to allow some things in but keep some things out. That's why you can absorb or eat some bad stuff, but it shouldn't be taken in through the bloodstream. That small intestine, once the food is digested and some bacteria are digested and some viruses are killed, those byproducts are supposed to leave. Or say the pesticides that are sprayed on your fruits, or the antibiotics that go into the cow, meat, pork, fish, mercury, whatever it is, your lining, if it's bulletproof enough and functioning enough, should be able to push the bad stuff out and allow good stuff in. Minerals, macronutrients like fats, carbohydrates and proteins, and fluid. So what happens sometimes is after you absorb the liquid nutrients that you want, the bad stuff continues on down and gets pushed into the colon. And the colon is just a storage sac until you're ready to poop it out. See? Poop. So the problem in leaky gut is when this part is either too full of bacteria, that's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and that's a disease process, or the lining is destroyed. There isn't this tight lining that keeps things in. It's a loose lining that allows anything in, and that can happen with chronic damage. Just like your skin. Skin is supposed to keep fluid in, but keep harsh things out. And that's why we walk around, hopefully non-infected and without rashes. But when the skin gets broken down, like if you wash too much or you have dry skin, it opens you up to get fungal infections, pain, infections by bacteria, right? Same thing will happen with the lining of this small intestine. And this thing is nothing but muscle. It's a muscle circular that is essentially just a tube. And it's supposed to use that muscle and push this food on through, absorb as much as possible, because the action kind of squeezes like a snake. It pushes the bolus of food on through, or the liquid on through, until as it passes through the villi, that's the lining. It's a little brush-like lining, microscopic brush. So if you whisk liquid through that brush, you should be able to take all the nutrients out of the liquid and keep all the bad stuff in the liquid, so that it goes into the colon, right? So when the lining is destroyed, it allows everything through. So that's why sometimes huge proteins get through and they're not supposed to get through. And then the body says, the bloodstream, that once it gets through the lining, it goes into the bloodstream and circulates into the bloodstream. Then it goes everywhere at that point. The bloodstream's a highway to the brain, to the heart, to white blood cells. And if you have bad things start to go from the lining into the bloodstream, well, the bloodstream, you have these white blood cells, and white blood cells attack. Macrophages in the bloodstream attack anything that seems foreign. And those things like big proteins, metals, they cause a reaction in the bloodstream, and the reaction sets off the inflammatory cascade, or an inflammatory reaction. And that's what causes, supposedly, when you have white blood cells that are in the bloodstream all irritated, they'll not just stay in the bloodstream. Those white blood cells that are irritated, they'll go everywhere. And they'll start attacking joints in the form of rheumatoid arthritis. They'll start attacking the thyroid in the form of Hashimoto's. They'll start attacking the ovaries in the form of maybe polycystic ovarian syndrome, skin in the form of dermatitis, seborrhea, psoriasis, hair in the form of alopecia. So it'll do all those things. That's the inflammatory reaction. And it all starts with a breakdown of the lining of the small intestine. Now, there's supposed to be this very, very delicate balance between the lining, the mucus that's in here, and then even in the colon, there's supposed to be a very good balance of bacteria. There's millions of bacteria. More bacterial DNA is in you than you actually have native DNA from your tissues. And that's this symbiotic relationship between all the bacteria that we carry in the colon and the way those bacteria break down some more tissues and create really good hormones like serotonin. And we protect the bacteria, the bacteria protect us. It's symbiotic. But the problem is when we wipe out the majority of the bacteria in here, here's a couple of bacteria with happy faces. When we wipe out all the good bacteria, what's left are bad bacteria, essentially because the antibiotics that I used for a sinus infection killed all the sinus bacteria, but they also killed the good guys in the colon. The bad guys are left. I didn't draw a bad guy, but bad guys are left, and when the bad guys are left, no more good guys. The bad guys say, ooh, we can duplicate, we can triplicate, quadruple, and we'll have essentially a colony filling the colon of bad guys. That's sometimes considered C. diff, or if you're really unfortunate, candida, or other bad bacterias. When you have an overwhelming amount of bad bacterias, one brand, instead of a multitude of different species, then those bacteria start to cause havoc. They release endotoxins, they cause the bowels to get all irritated. And remember, this is live tissue, and this is where the beauty of, I guess, leaky gut comes in, because you'll notice it, Darlene noticed it. What happens is when the lining of this small intestine or the lining of the colon becomes irritated, this is live tissue, and it's all muscle. Remember, from the mouth to the butt, you have about 36 feet of tubing, and all that tubing is muscle. So muscle's alive. When this lining gets irritated from overgrowth of weird bacteria or just toxins, say food allergies that normally you'd be able to push on through, but the food allergies start to irritate, get into the wall and cause an inflammatory reaction in the gut, Crohn's disease, IBS, ulcerative colitis. Well, the bowels, what's cool is the bowels, which are normally, especially let's take the small intestine, the bowels, which are normally tiny and say garden hose size, they become fire hose size. So you have a bowel that enlarges to almost 3 times its size. And this just went from tiny to huge. So this whole long small intestinal tube almost is becoming as thick and round as the colon. There's not enough room for that. So essentially what happens is you take a garden hose diameter, small intestine, and because it's irritated, it becomes fire hose diameter. And there's no room in the gut for fire hose size because it was previously just used to this little tiny hose, 32 feet, 26 feet, and now you have fire hose, 32 feet, 26 feet. Well, the gut actually expands. So when you expand in size after eating bad food, irritating food, having an infection or post-antibiotic irritable bowel syndrome, you now become bloated. And with being bloated, you don't necessarily gain weight, but you gain a couple inches. And that's the fallacy, because some patients will go to the doctor's office and they say, I ate gluten or dairy by mistake last night and I gained weight. When actually it's not scale weight that they gain, it's size that they gain. Because a lot of people mistake an inch or 2 inch of size gain as being a couple pounds of weight, which it's not. It's just enlargement of the colon. I'm sorry, enlargement of the tube. Again, if the colon or the small intestine is this size and a bacteria or it's happy, it doesn't care about what's in there. But when you have an an irritant like a chemical or an allergen, food allergen, then suddenly the only thing that the small intestine can do is increase in size to stop touching this thing that's inside of its lumen. And what it does is it also goes like this to try to get it out, either down to the next organ, which is the colon, or up back to the stomach and make you vomit because it wants it out. But it goes from that to that. And that's why people get bloated. So that's the theory of what happens with bloating in leaky gut. Eventually, if you keep on doing that, then the small intestine just stays huge and it doesn't move, and you wind up getting constipated because this muscle is supposed to be dynamically going like this and pushing things down, 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 down. Well, it just expands and it doesn't move. So if it doesn't move, what's going to cause the movement downhill? Nothing, unless you have a huge high fiber diet, and most people are trying to avoid fiber. So I hope that you understand the concept of this, because if you understand the physiology, it really becomes easy to kind of see the dynamics of what happens as you're suffering. And when you can understand how you're suffering, it keeps you honest, because you don't want to take advantage of bad food, even if it's just once a weekend. And you do want to take advantage of eating high fiber. High fiber is what probiotics need. If you have a bunch of bacteria in here, say the probiotic you take, the yogurt you take, the kimchi that you take, the tofu you take, the pickled foods that you take, well, or there's the pill, the good bacteria will need food. And good bacteria, especially wide variety of species, will depend on wide variety of fiber. Fiber in the color spectrum of fruits and vegetables. So that's why it's important to have fiber. So folks that are following the paleo diet where you can't have any fiber, that would be fine for a short time. I always say it's important to move on to something that's more sustainable. I don't have anything against the paleo, but if you look at population studies, most of the longest lived populations in the world always include fiber in their diet. So no matter what author you're following, that is the concept of what I'm talking about. So if you have a good lively microbiota, and then you have a medium or a nice tube that the microbiota can exist in, and you have good movement on a regular basis, that the microbiota will be able to take the food on down, or get fed, essentially. They get fed on a regular basis, then they're happy. When they're happy, serotonin. When serotonin is released from the gut, you actually have more serotonin from the gut than you do from your brain. It fights depression, takes care of anxiety, makes muscle work well, gets you to sleep properly, which it accounts for a healthy gut, accounts for a healthy life. Gets you to absorb better. So all this stuff is important. It stops the inflammatory reaction, stops autoimmune disease. It's all beautiful, but unfortunately I think we learn to abuse our guts, abuse our diets, thinking we're bulletproof. And you know, as you're younger, I think that we can tolerate more. But as you get older, number one, you'll have more damage accumulated over the course of several decades. Number two, the damaged lining won't tolerate as much as it did when you were younger. So that, in addition to all the stressors we take on as we get older, sets up for a bad gut and a bad life. So Darlene, that was a great question. Hopefully that answered or gave you an idea about why you gain size, not weight, but size. In fact, Darlene gained size 2 inches or so, but she lost weight when she came in and got weighed on the scales. So that's a perfect example of what happens with bloating. And then the bloating goes away after a couple hours. Sometimes people feel that they pass gas and they feel better, or they just let the inflammatory wave, the inflammation in the dilated small intestine kind of calm down again, and they suddenly feel a little better. Supposedly a couple hours to a day or two. So hopefully you all, aside from Darlene, you all don't have this disease process, but again, as you understand the disease process, you'll see how good, and you'll know that it's worth it to stick to a somewhat restrictive diet. It's worth it to continue with bacteria or probiotic. It's worth it to eat healthy, maintain good sleep, and exercise every day. So subscribe to me for more questions. Otherwise, stay healthy.